I'm Jeff Asher, and this is the Jeff-alytics Podcast. We perceive policing in America through a complex mix of law, politics, and lived experiences. The headlines often focus on crisis or conflict, but the real work of reform often happens quietly, in places like community meetings and courtrooms. In this episode, I talked with Ganesha Martin, whose journey from practicing law to leading police reform efforts in Baltimore and now Minneapolis offers a rare and fascinating inside look at how change actually takes shape. We talk about what it means to work under federal and state oversight, how to balance innovation with accountability, and why community engagement is as essential to reform as any policy or budget line. Ganesha also shares how public perception, and sometimes misconception, shapes the national narrative on policing, crime trends, and safety. She argues that reform isn't just about reducing harm, it's about restoring confidence, investing in officers, and telling a more complete story of what public safety can be. Here's my conversation with Ganesha Martin on the reality of reform, the importance of storytelling, and the future of policing beyond the headlines. My guest today is the incomparable Ganesha Martin. Ganesha, thanks for joining me.
It is my pleasure to be here with you. We're usually running into each other like in hallways or boring Zooms. So I'm very happy to be with you this morning.
Good. Hopefully not a boring podcast record then. So I've done a few of these interviews now, and frequently it's, talking to professors, people that you go through the background and it's a very quick, here's your background. You, I think, is very different in that you have this incredible wide range of experiences. So can you walk me through your background and how you got to be where you are now?
Yeah, I don't know if it's because God loves me or God hates me, but this was never planned. So I'm a lawyer by education and training. Often joke I'm like a recovering attorney. And I don't know if I'm like out of my mind to go from practicing law into policing. But quite by happenstance, over a decade now ago, I had moved to D.C. And through a series of getting to know different lawyers, my first time in Baltimore. I was having coffee with a lawyer. Somebody walked in that knew the mayor, and they were like, "You should work for the mayor of Baltimore." And I'm like, "I'm going to Italy next week. Like, I don't know about." They're like, "No, you should work for the mayor of Baltimore." So I went over there. I had an interview. She never looked up from her BlackBerry. That tells you when it was, because she was on the BlackBerry. You're probably too even young to even remember a BlackBerry. But
I had a BlackBerry. I very much had a BlackBerry.
Okay. So she never looked up. So I was like, that didn't go well. But then I got a call and they invited me over. And it was interesting. It was a special assistant, which if you Google special assistant, there's no consistent definition. But I had just graduated from a program called Emerge that trains women to run for political office. So I was like, let me try this. And I got to go with her everywhere. So if it was a homicide scene, if it was the opening of a new school, if it was meeting with our congressional delegation, if it was meeting with the council, so I really got a feel for Baltimore. And she had decided to bring in an outside police commissioner. I wasn't from Baltimore, so I didn't understand the history at the time, but there was a huge rift with the police and the community. The administration prior had arrested 1 in 6 people in Baltimore, had brought a lot of that broken windows, those sorts of things from some New York folks. Some New York folks that come into Baltimore, and kind of the way they did it, they caused a rift. And so she went out and she got a chief from California. And I always make a joke that to see East Coast policing meet West Coast policing, it's like the worst playoff game you ever want to see. It was very, very interesting. But anyway, that chief, that commissioner, saw how politically connected I was and asked me to come over to be his chief of staff. And I had been contemplating, what is it like to be a chief of staff? That looks like an interesting role. And so I went over. And so that's how I ended up in the BPD. And this commissioner was very focused on reform. I really haven't talked about this publicly. I usually talk about this over drinks. But what was interesting, I think enough time has passed at this point, where he had connects up in the cop's office. And they were telling him, look, DOJ is looking at y'all for a consent decree. You need to get your crap together. So
can I ask what year is this?
Ron Davis probably okay at this point for me telling you this. So this was Ron Davis. This was under the Obama administration. And so we started working to get our stuff together. But this is also around Ferguson, start what happened. And so I was asked to go up to our legislature because they were going to fix policing. And I was asked to go up there and just make sure that everything that was actually done was done in a way that served both police and community. And I told the commissioner, I said, look, I'm not from here. I just got here. But let me tell you, this community does not dislike police. They hate police. And I was dealing with the activists at the time around 2015. So I asked if I could create the Bureau of Community Engagement so I could focus on those relationships. He said yes. And then I got a call the next day to get back to the city. We had a very serious injury of a young Black man who was in critical condition. And turns out that was Freddie Gray. So when I got back to the city, now I was overseeing community, the politicians, and media. You know the story. Shortly thereafter, we were in the riots and the uprising. That commissioner was out. Commissioner Davis was in. I can joke about this now, but my title was the chief of the Department of Justice, Compliance, Accountability, and External Affairs. I literally put every word I could in there because I was looking for a new job. I was not staying. I was ready to go. Look, so if I could work for the DOJ, I could do compliance. I could go to external affairs. Anyway, long story short, because this story's already long, but he asked me to stay and lead the DOJ compliance stuff. At that time, after Freddie Gray, we were doing collateral reform or whatever it was.
Collaborative reform.
Thank you. There you go. Collaborative reform. So we were in there with collaborative reform with the cops. And when civil rights came in, civil rights pretty much told cops, get out. They're on their own right now. And they started investigating us. And Kevin Davis asked me to help be the liaison there. And then the last thing cops did was pay for me to go around to different cities to see what they were doing well and what they were not doing so well in consent decrees. And that's when I actually first met you when I came to New Orleans and was able to see everything there. And so I continued to do that job. When Kevin Davis was let go, I didn't want to stay. I didn't know the next guy was going to get arrested, but he did. And so I was asked to be on monitoring teams across the country that led into a consulting business, helping police and communities across the country. Then I was asked to be the VP of Community Affairs and Public Policy at Mark 43, which I really tried to help police departments leverage their data to be responsive to the political and community and rank and file needs. And then we're rounding this out here. I was asked by Chief O'Hara for lots of months to come to Minneapolis. I didn't think it was in the cards for me. And then this last time he asked me at a major city chiefs convening, I prayed on it. I decided to come, and I've been here for 3 months. It feels like 30 years. Because I am now, I am my official role is the first civilian chief of constitutional policing, but his chief of staff quit about a month into my tenure. And so I am also acting chief of staff, which oversees media, which, as you know, we have had some big situations happen, including the Annunciation tragedy where we lost 2 babies and all the other things that have been happening here. 2 mass shootings in the past 3 days, and then also just a plethora of other things. So been super busy, but I'm very happy to be back in the throes of things. Oh, I did forget one other thing. I went back to the city for a while, and I was the director of Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, where I oversaw the implementation of the CVI work that is actually going on in Baltimore right now. You're right. It did zigzag kind of all over the place, but that's the gist of it.
I love it. I mean, obviously you have, incredible experiences from that. Whenever, I guess my kids aren't asking me what they should do professionally yet. They're too little. But whenever I'm asked sort of like, what's the best approach to your profession? It's go where it's interesting and go where you feel like you'll be fulfilled. And I think
it's true.
You're the personification of that.
It's true. I've made up like some of my last 3 positions. Just make it up.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the best way to work.
Yeah.
So all of these experiences, working very intensely in the weeds in Baltimore and then sort of more broadly at Mark 43, how do those experiences impact what you're trying to do in Baltimore, in Minneapolis? And I guess, can you sort of expound upon like what exactly is the goal of your Minneapolis work right now?
I kind of describe this work as twofold. It's the only reason really that I love it so much. There is what I call the letter of the agreement. So a lot of people don't know this. Minneapolis is going to be the only city in police history to comply with a state settlement agreement with MDHR and the federal consent decree. And most people know that the federal consent decree was pulled back by the current administration, but the mayor here, by executive order, said that we are going to do every word of the consent decree.
DOJ had a consent decree in Minneapolis, and then the administration changed. DOJ pulled that back, and Minneapolis says we're just going to do it anyway.
Pretty much, yeah. It was in the courts. The courts had not approved it. And even though the city had signed off, DOJ had signed off, the courts had not approved it. And so since it was sitting in the court's queue when the Trump administration came in, they took it out. They said, we don't want this anymore. And yeah, it was off the table. Matter of fact, my first week, it was the press conference to announce me, the press conference to announce one of the monitors' report. And then the third press conference that week was no consent decree for Minneapolis. Yes. And as you know, one agreement is already a lot. So here we are trying to comply with two. Then on top of that, you have, so I'm doing that piece. And so that is the letter of the agreement. The spirit of the agreement is what gets me going, because the spirit of the agreement is where you can get innovative, right? So right now, let's say we have like 5,000 things that our supervisors have to do. They got to check this. They got to check that. They got to do all this stuff. But I know that they're short on the streets. I know their calls for service volume. And so I get to sit here with my team and say, is there a technological solution to help our supervisors do what the agreements are asking them to do to help them get the job done? Or there's a concept that I've been kind of playing around with that I've been calling human-centered policing. And I think in a lot of reform efforts, it leans very heavy on the legal premises, which I understand has to happen. But very rarely do we really center the people that these policies affect the most. That's community and police, like on the ground, still pushing a patrol car police, not sitting in a cute office. And so I really, here in Minneapolis, want us to be the model. What does it look like to create innovative, practical reform that speaks to the experience of police and community? It's hard as hell. I call it the messy middle. But if we can do that in Minneapolis, we can do it anywhere. And as you know, policing is in a very interesting place right now. And I do think that in the next couple of years, when we kind of stop having whiplash, folks are going to look around and say, where's the model? Who did it well? And I hope that, they turn to us. And the last thing I'll say on this, and you can appreciate this, you can't do this work in a vacuum. Like I said, we had 2 mass shootings in the past week, several, folks injured. People are still expecting us to keep them safe while we're doing all this reform. And so, keeping all that in mind.
I know that the public perceptions of consent decrees can wildly vary. Do you have any sense about what the public sort of thinks about your work and your approach, and whether this is going to be harmful to policing or effective policing?
It's very interesting. I didn't know much about Minneapolis before I came. It is not what I expected. I love the city, actually. There's great food. It's beautiful, all the things. But some people call this the mini Seattle. Very progressive politics. Now, call me crazy. A lot of people are like, duh, but I mean, and I guess if you look at what happened, after George Floyd, it's not like, it shouldn't be shocking, but very, very progressive politics here. And so I think you have folks that really, really support the work, want to see it get done. But even with that piece, practical, right, is important. Let's look at after the murder of George Floyd. You had people who voted to defund the police. You put a referendum on to defund the police and the people voted it down. To me, that tells you exactly where you are, where you have some very vocal people who were saying defund the police and and just do this ultra reform. But you have people in communities where they go to sleep to the sound of gunshots. They're worried about their kids walking and playing outside. And they're like, no, I want police. I want more police. I just want them to act constitutionally and be fair when they respond in my community. And so to me, that's the driving force for the work. And because you still have to have cops to be able to do their job. But if you put a badge on, you get the honor to wear a gun, then you need to treat community respectfully. And one of the things that I love about the trends, and certainly you're the king of knowing all the trends, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we're in a place where you're actually able to see Baltimore is a good example. Reform can move forward and you can have record reduction in violence. It's not an either or. And I'm glad that it's happening not with marginal numbers. It's happening with huge numbers. You know, that's the goalpost. That's the thing I say to people. And it helps that it's Baltimore. I don't think that I don't know if Minneapolis has ever been called the murder capital of, the entire world. But Baltimore has the wire, all those sorts of things. If Baltimore can do it, pretty much anybody can do it.
Do you think people believe that? I mean, the idea of the podcast, the general idea is this like gap between perception and reality.
Yeah.
People always think crime is rising no matter what. How do you sort of balance that in a place like Baltimore where it's obvious, chart went up, chart clearly going down, versus maybe a place like Minneapolis where it's more complicated? You saw murder rose a lot and now it's coming down, but it's still elevated. Violent crime rose a lot. It's coming down. It's still elevated. How do you balance all of this and also push this pro-reform message?
But I'm going to tell you right now, I know Baltimore. If you went and did some man on the street interviews, they'll be like, yeah, I know what the mayor said about crime. But yeah, no, you know what I'm saying? I'm speaking out of turn because I haven't been there in the streets in a while, but I'm going to venture to say you have the politicians, you've got the business people, you've got a lot of people who it bodes well for to say that violence is down, but you have some people that are still living in the neighborhoods and still experiencing certain things that just don't believe it. And as a matter of fact, I was just on a plane with somebody who was very much, they actually had started an anti-violence movement in Baltimore. And I go, look at the numbers. And they go, they're messing with those numbers. Those aren't the real numbers. You know what I'm saying? And so you asked me this question. It makes me go back to when I was working for the mayor of Baltimore. And she used to get so frustrated. She was like, I've got the numbers down lower than they've ever been and didn't get credit for any of it. Now, nationally, people love to talk about it, but locally, they were like, y'all suck, right? And so, you know how they say like all politics are local? I think all crime is local, right? And there's this big chasm in what the media reports, okay, and what the media wants you to feel and what people experience on the ground. And I'll give you an example, right? So in Baltimore and here, what they want to report on is the violence. How many people shot? How many people died? How many murder? If we had a property, kind of crime stories going on, but that was because it was smashed. They were smashing windows at hundreds at a time. And so they wanted to report on that. But that when you go to communities, they care about their bike being stolen. They care about the assaults. The business owners care about people shoplifting. And then the people who you want to come into the city to help economically boost, they're the ones paying attention to how violent it is. And they feel like they're going to get carjacked and all that sort of stuff. And so I think, first of all, the media does a disservice. I just heard a statistic last night that like when you don't have a lot of local media and you have all these media conglomerates that are buying up these small stations, that you can literally look across 200 to 300 news stations and they're all saying and reporting the same thing. I think you can't discount the role the media plays. But at the heart of your question, I think it's because what the media reports and what people care about are two different things. And if you're hearing about, I'll just use my neighborhood. If they're getting all their Amazon packages stolen, they feel unsafe. But what can police do about that? Not a lot.
Very little.
unless we're in Mayberry. Not in an urban setting. It's not happening. So that's what I really think. I don't know. This is your podcast, so it's probably not etiquette for me to ask you. But like, what do you think?
Okay.
Okay. Well,
No,
talk
I
over it.
think that's part of it. Certainly, you speak to the porch piracy, and had Philip Bump on the podcast, and we talked about very similar things, that it's not just the porch piracy. It's that I can see my doorbell, and if somebody steals it, one, I can viscerally see it being stolen.
Yeah.
And then I have a place like next door that I can go on and I can post it. And I can look, oh, my neighbor 3 months ago posted something like that.
Yeah.
You know, it's an epidemic.
Or if you're like this on my ring, it's going off all freaking day. Oh, there's this. Oh, there's that. Oh, there's this. Yeah. And so people feel unsafe, and police can't do anything about it, so
it's very difficult. It doesn't inherently, your clearance rates are in the single digits probably for things like that. And there's very little you can do. And it's probably something that doesn't get measured very well to begin with. So we don't even know, is there more of it? Or are we just aware of more of it?
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And I mean, I think about a letter that we got just recently around investigations. There was a woman who was killed, a domestic violence incident. And as you know, in most police departments, I mean, you're just short. You don't have the amount of people that you need. And not that one crime is more important than another. But certainly when there's an act of violence on someone versus property and you are short staffed all around, you're going to focus on those pieces. But you still have these other people that are feeling unsafe and unsupported by the police.
Kind of segueing from that, if, both specifically in Minneapolis and just generally for police departments, for policymakers and leadership, there's going to come a time when we're seeing everything go down. The numbers say everything's going down. At some point, that's going to level off, and we're going to see things go up. A good example, I think, of this is in 2022. Somebody posted on TikTok how to steal certain models of Kias and Hyundais. Every police department across the country saw enormous increases in auto thefts. When things change, and they often change for complex reasons that have nothing to do with the police department, how do policymakers and police departments, how can they better address that, yes, this is happening, this is a real issue that we're aware of, the solutions are complicated, and it's not just the police's fault, go fix it type solution, that may not be the answer.
Yeah. So I always start with this framework, which is so difficult. Police are the most politically charged entity there is. And I call it the hottest political football, out there. If you just say police, go into a room and say police, automatically you're going to get visceral responses of I love my police or I hate the police. You know what I'm saying? The unfortunate thing is that depending, because you mentioned policymakers, right? It depends on the responsibility and dare I say it, the cojones, and I do believe women have cojones as well, to get educated and understand the complexity and nuance of whatever is happening in your city. Try to explain it because it's difficult when it's just sound bites, and then come up with a collaborative, comprehensive strategy to the issue, right? Because trying to just put police on that Hyundai issue is ludicrous. We already know we don't have enough people, but if you invest in some technology, you have the right partnerships that you need at the state, local, and federal level. As you know, a lot of people sued, those companies, and prosecutorial support, as you know, it varies, from across the country, depending on who you're dealing with. I just talked to a chief yesterday. He is in a city where the elected state's attorney or prosecutor is super liberal. The idea of being tough on crime, not possible. But this chief went to him and said, this particular cohort of people, very small, we need this type of response. And you can say you're surgical with how you're attacking violence, not using, a big net. That very liberal person bought off on it. And now they have a situation where they've been able to reduce that issue together. So the politics right now are super convoluted, as you know, from the state, local, and federal level. I mean, people don't know what way is up, what way is down, north, south, west. And I think it's going to continue to be like that for a little bit. And so I've totally lost your question because I've gone out on the read page.
I never feel it.
You throw politics in there and my brain starts to cross wires.
My question was about the weather.
Oh, exactly. It's raining cats and dogs, brother. That's what's happening. And the cats and dogs have sharp claws.
No. That was great. If you could, since you're knee deep in this issue, can you walk through one sort of very basically like what the general idea behind the consent decrees are and how you see the future of these developing, especially in light of, a frankly hostile administration to the idea of consent-led reform?
Okay. Well, I can tell you the future in this administration is non-existent. I mean, the Trump administration has made it 1000% clear that they do not support consent decrees. And what's interesting, I didn't realize this until I spoke at CCJ recently. Before I went on stage, I realized my career as far as consent decrees is bookended in a very interesting way. So the first consent decree in Baltimore, we actually signed it the night of Trump's first inauguration. Jeff Sessions was asked at his confirmation what he thinks about consent decrees, and I abhor them. They handcuff cops and all that. The DOJ under the first Trump administration came down and tried to take back the consent decree from Baltimore. And I think it's the first and probably only time that the police and the community stood up and said, no, we want a consent decree. Look, we knew in Baltimore we had to have a consent decree. Would we have preferred to do it a different way? Perhaps. But when I tell you that we're the 8th largest police department in the United States and the cops were still handwriting their reports, and from looking at the data that most of your violence is retaliatory, so that at the end of a shift, somebody comes, they write their report, they put it in an old mailbox, somebody comes and picks it up and drives it down to HQ, and people who are on light duty type it in, and then an email comes out, and you're asking cops to solve violence and crime this way? You're asking too much. That's not going to happen. That was the only way to get the investment in our minds that we needed in the police department to then be responsible and responsive to the community.
Taking a step back, can you kind of very briefly, 10,000 foot level, just sort of explain what the consent decrees do in general?
So what's funny in a lot of cities is they call them dissent decrees, and they don't even do it on purpose. But I have seen this now in 3 cities where they call it dissent decree instead of consent decree. A consent decree essentially is this. So there is a federal law that says that the Department of Justice, particularly the Civil Rights Division, can come in and do an investigation of a police department to see if there is a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. Usually it happens after a very large event, a seminal event like Breonna Taylor, like George Floyd, like Freddie Gray, not always like Michael Brown and Ferguson. And so it doesn't always happen like that, but generally that it can be the catalyst for an investigation. The investigations can last anywhere from like 8 months to like 2 years, sometimes even longer. And they're looking at your data. They're looking at your policies. They're interviewing. They're doing ride-alongs. They're talking to community. Then they come up with a findings report that says, yeah, they have a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. And then at that point, the police department has the ability to say, yeah, we're going to work on it, or no, we're going to fight you on it. Early on in consent decree land, a lot of police departments fought it, but generally the DOJ is not going to open an investigation unless they think they already got you dead to rights anyway. So you agree to make some changes in your police department, and that actual agreement that you come up with is the consent decree. And generally, when it's federal, it's overseen by a federal judge. You get a monitor that's made up of police experts, and they help the judge determine whether you are in compliance. And some of these things take 7 to 10 years. There are some places that have been in a consent decree up to 20 years.
New Orleans is 12 years in, 13 years in now?
Yeah, I think Puerto Rico and Oakland are the heavyweight champions right now in the length.
New Orleans hopefully will be out in the next 2 years, fingers crossed.
Yeah. They are on the right track from what I heard, particularly because they got Mark 43. So
gotta give the shout out.
Yeah.
That's great. So, I mean, in general, though, because it's overseen by a federal judge, just because DOJ does not agree with the consent decree, those that are already signed are still able to go on and continue, right?
Still able to go on, but then you've got the case of Louisville. So same thing happened to Louisville. They had agreed to the consent decree, signed, sealed, but not delivered. The judge was like, well, let's just wait and see what the Trump administration says. The Trump administration was like, yeah, we don't want this. And so no consent decree in Louisville. And that was a big blow to a lot of folks because of Breonna Taylor's death. But there is an RFP out right now, and they're in the process of choosing a monitor. I think they've got it down to 2 finalists. So they're going to have a monitor, right? So there is an acknowledgement there that a consent decree, if done well, can be helpful to a police department. And so I think they're going to do the consent decree without it being entered, but they will have a monitor to help them. And that's the other thing I want to point out, Jeff, around consent decrees is it forces you to get the right technology, to get the right staffing, at least civilians that can help you get this stuff done. But, you know, it also brings in expertise from outside that helps you get it done. And if police departments could go to their city councils and get this money and this support without being forced by an agreement, you might not need these as much. Now, you also know it depends on the police department if they actually want to make the changes or not. And some police departments, and some police departments will be like, I'll make 30%, but I am not going to do that whole thing. So, you know, you can use it as a tool to get the investment in your department that you've needed for, you know, a long time.
What do you say to the argument that they're so expensive, we can't afford this, it's going to bankrupt the city? That sort of line of argument.
You're getting me riled up here. Let me just say something.
Sorry.
let me say something. And I like to approach anything equal part cop, equal part community. I think it's necessary. But I'm going to go probably a little cop heavy right now, just for a second. A society cannot ask men and women, fathers and mothers, daughters and sisters to come to a job where you have to wear a vest to protect your internal organs. The worst me and you are going to do today, Jeff, is I say something stupid on your podcast and you were like, wow, that was horrible talking to that lady. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's the worst. Even a hump.
I do not. This has been delightful.
Even a hump, and I hate humps, but even a hump who is not doing their job on the police department, particularly in this environment. We just had 3 cops shot in somewhere in Pennsylvania or something. More cops are being ambushed, and we have had record suicides. Okay. Those cops who ran into Annunciation last week or however many weeks ago and saw those babies, they're struggling right now to go back to life, to go back to being mothers and fathers when they had to see the baby 8-year-old and then they got to go home to see their 8-year-old and then send their 8-year-old to school. So when you're asking somebody to do all that, you cannot not give them top-notch technology. You cannot not give them the best cars and radios. You can't not do that. You need to give them top-notch policy that is clear, that speaks to what they are going through on the street. You need to invest in the training. Most of our training units around the country don't have air, don't have heat. Some of them in Baltimore, I was shocked to find out they didn't even have Wi-Fi at the freaking academy. And you're telling them to go out and be officer friendly when there's rats running around. There is a precinct right now in Minneapolis Police Department where there was sewage in the sink last week.
Oh, God.
Sewage backed up from the freaking toilets in the sink. So let me just tell you what. Communities shouldn't have to live that way, but you can't ask a cop to come and put their lives on the line, and that's how you freaking treat them. I'm just saying. So, again, lost the question, but I'm sure it has to do with consent decrees. Maybe what was
the expense of fulfilling the
okay, boom. Okay, so that's the one side of it. Now let me go back over here. Unfortunately, in police departments, they take cops, and you know this to be true. Oh, you were a great homicide detective. You probably can be a great CFO. Oh, you could probably run HR. You know, you were good at investigations.
Yeah.
No. There are people who went to have degrees for this, and there's some of them are cops, but you know, there's degrees. People are trained for this, and we've got to professionalize in the police department. So when you have taken a cop off the street and asked them to write policies, and you've not given them the right resources to get it done, then that horrible policy is now training the cops. Now the cops are out there with the community. So the expense is only because of lack of investment for decades before on the one side. Now, let's talk about monitors.
Right.
Okay. Hey, there was a guy, I'm making probably so many enemies on this podcast, but there was a guy who was getting paid $750 an hour to be a monitor. I'm sorry, unless it's Boca Raton or somewhere that they just have plenty of money, I think that's just crazy. I think it's crazy. So I do think that there are people out there who are taking money, who are not 100% up to par to help police departments get the job done. But on the whole, there is no way you can get top-notch, best practice work done without a consulting team of outsiders to help you in most police departments. And if that has to come in the face of a monitor, so be it. But again, if this type of investment would be made without being forced, you wouldn't have to be here. But since that does not happen, and we have to force everybody in a city to get on board, then right now the consent decree has been the best thing to do that. Now, people can come up with something better in the future, but if you want better policing, you've got to invest in it, and you got to make sure the investment is actually with quality people, quality training, quality policies, quality technology, quality accountability metrics. And that's actually very hard crap to do, particularly when you're short on you're short staffed and you don't have the professional staff to actually do the work, which is most police departments across the country.
That's great. Thank you. Last question. I love it. I'm going to steal it whenever I'm talking about consent decrees, because as a fan of them in general, and also being in New Orleans is like a defender of the local consent decree, having seen the good that it has done in New Orleans.
Yeah.
It's not perfect, but good.
Yeah.
It's sometimes hard to respond to that. And I think that that's a great response. So thank you. So what's next? Final question is, what's next for you?
Well, I make quite a sacrifice, and people do all the time. I don't want any pats on the back, but you know, I moved out here to Minneapolis. Actually, they texted me the other day, "You're late on your rent." And I was like, I don't have rent. My husband pays my mortgage. And then I realized, oh crap, I do have rent. And my husband is in Maryland. So I get to see him every now and again, but not as often as I want. But I am so dedicated to getting this right in Minneapolis, because I just have a firm belief that what we're able to do here is going to have the potential to affect the whole profession. I hope we come up with amazing policies, amazing training, amazing technology. I'm hoping to build a lab off of the department so that we can kind of test and prove a lot of our practices here. And then after that, I don't know. I don't know. You tell me.
That's good enough. No, that sounds like plenty on your plate. I appreciate that. And certainly I recognize, you know, it's one thing to point to a chart. It's another thing to do the work and to have success and to build policies that you succeed with, and try things that maybe fail and then you don't try those again. But I think when I think about like, how do we change these perceptions about, you know, getting to the podcast idea of the crime trends, but also the broader trends around policing and criminal justice and the state of crime in our country, I think that's the exact approach. You just have to try and have successes.
You have to try, you have to have successes. And I'm so glad you said what you said, because this is important, and we don't do this well in policing. We do not tell our own story. The stories that we tell are either in academia, we tell them to each other, at our conferences, but community engagement, education, and exposure, we are not good at it. We've got to do it, because the same way the crime is local, and I talked about the media, our message has to be local. And so as we build out a new community engagement strategy, which is I'm doing that here, we've got to change the conversation at the local level. And we don't do that well. And I'm hoping to change that here, because that's how those perceptions are going to start changing, making these mini ambassadors to say, you know what? Yeah, but did you know this? Yeah, actually, this is really what's going on. We're starting that a little bit with our community MSTAT. So giving the real facts, giving the real truth, and having those conversations, I think that's something that we've got to work on in the future for sure. Telling our own story and the way that we do it.
That's awesome.
And this helps the podcast.
Good. I hope so. Good. Everybody listen. Tell everybody you know. Ganesha, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. This has been wonderful. Thanks for listening to the Jeff-alytics Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and to learn more, head on over to ahdatalytics.com for more information and previous episodes. If you like what you heard, please leave a glowing review, which will help others to discover the show. Until next time, I'm Jeff Asher.